So, welcome back. I hope you all had a nice and relaxing Thanksgiving break. So the final thing we are going to cover in this class is clustering. So this is an example of unsupervised learning. So remember we talked earlier in the quarter about how supervised learning, we had training samples that would have labels. And with unsupervised learning, we have no labels associated with our samples. And so specifically, what we're trying to do is the following. We're going to be given samples xi for I equals 1 to n, where each xi is a p-dimensional vector, like we've been doing all quarter. And what we want to do is assign each one of them to a cluster. So we're going to let capital K here correspond to the number of clusters, and we're going to denote the clusters C1, C2, all the way through C capital K. So each cluster is a subset of our n different samples here. And the goal is that we set this up so that points, or xi's, in the same cluster are somehow close, and points in different clusters are distant. Okay, so visually, we could imagine having a collection of points that looks like this, and setting k, the number of clusters, being equal to 2. And so if I cluster these by saying that here is one cluster C1 and here is another cluster C2, then within each cluster the points are close relative to how far apart any pair of points from different clusters are to one another. Okay, so that's the basic idea of what we want to accomplish. And in particular, there's going to be two kind of main types of clustering that we are going to consider. So the first is called hard clustering. And what I mean by this is that each of our xi's is assigned to only one cluster. So this is sort of like what I drew on the other board. Each point is in either cluster 1 or cluster 2. It's not in both. And we're going today to talk about a specific hard clustering method called k-means. The alternative is soft clustering. And with soft clustering, the idea is that each point can be in more than one cluster. And what we try to think about is the likelihood of each point being assigned to each cluster. So a point xi can be in more than one cluster. And we estimate the likelihood of each point being in each cluster. And so on Thursday, for our final class, we're going to talk about one specific way to do this, and that's going to be the expectation maximization, or EM algorithm. And we'll talk about some of the differences and trade-offs between these two approaches, why you'd want to use one when you'd like to use the other. And And so that's just an overview of the rest of the course. Are there any questions so far? Actually, let me give you a little illustration here before we really get rolling with k-means. So let's imagine that we have a data set that looks something like this. So we've got a whole bunch of samples here. And they kind of look like Mickey Mouse here, right? And I'm going to draw this data set twice. These are supposed to be samples in the same points, in the same locations. Okay, so what we're going to see is that when we try to take a data set like this and apply a method like k-means, what we will often see is clusters that maybe aren't exactly like we might expect, where we would see, if we did 3 clusters, perhaps something like this. And in contrast, when we do expectation maximization, what we're going to see is that it allows us to take into account the covariance of the points within each cluster, and we'll talk more about what exactly that means. But what it can do is it can result in the clusters having very different sizes, because we're ultimately trying to have a different sort of objective function that we're trying to optimize. And so the algorithm that we're going to talk about today, k-means, is very simple. We can use it very easily. It's trivial to code up, and it's widely used across machine learning. But it does sort of not take into account the, again, covariance or the spread of points within each cluster. And so it can produce results that can feel a little bit less intuitive than what we might see with the EM algorithm. And so we'll talk more about what's going on in this example and how to think about the differences between the different methods as we get into the guts of how they work. Okay, so with that, let's talk in detail about k-means clustering. So specifically, we are going to let mu sub k be a vector in p dimensions, and we are going to let this represent the center of the kth cluster. And this is for k equals 1 all the way to capital K. Okay, so what we'd like to do then is assign our points, the xi's, to the clusters so that each point is close to one of the cluster means. So okay, so what we want to do is we want to assign our points, the xi's, to the clusters so that the sum of the squared distances between each point and its assigned cluster center is as small as possible. So in other words, we're going to say here C1, C2, all the way through to C capital K. And then I'm going to put a little hat here to correspond to the output of our algorithm, our estimate of the clusters. That's going to correspond to doing a search over all possible clusterings, C1, C2 through CK, and choosing the one that's best in the sense of the following. So we are going to sum over all of the different clusters. And for each cluster, we are going to sum over all of the xi's that are in that cluster. So where we assign a point xi to a cluster if it's closer to that mean versus any other mean. And then we are going to look at the squared distance between xi and that cluster mean. Between the point xi and the cluster mean mu k. And we are going to have this mu k formally be the sum over all the points assigned to the cluster of the vector. And then we are going to divide by the number of points inside the cluster. So if we define a cluster CK, it's just a collection of different points. So maybe I'll draw my little toy drawing again. I've got this collection of points. So if I were to say that this collection here was cluster 1, then what I'm doing here is, first of all, I am defining mu1 to be the average of all of these points. So I can think about that as being the center here of my cluster. So this would be my mu1. And now what I'm trying to do, and similarly for mu2. And so what I'm doing with this objective is I'm saying, let me choose the clusters or the partitioning of all of my samples, the xi's, so that when I form those clusters and compute their means, that the sum of distances between each point in the cluster and that cluster mean are as small as possible. So I'm looking at the sum of all of the squared distances within this cluster, and then separately I'm looking at the sum of all the squared distances of all the points in this other cluster. And I want the total sum of all of the squared distances for all the different points to be as small as possible. Does that make sense? Okay, so I just want to say for later that I am going to call this the objective. Okay, so more generally in optimization, we would call this the objective function, and we are trying to minimize the objective function. But I'm giving it a special name here because we're going to talk about some theoretical properties in a little bit based on how big or how small this objective function value is for different choices of CK. So I'm just defining that for later, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But before we start thinking about specific algorithms in theory, I want to highlight that one thing that's kind of nice and perhaps even a little bit more intuitive than the original objective is an equivalent representation. So this is equivalent to saying we're going to choose our clusters. Oops. By trying to minimize the sum of the squared pairwise distances within each cluster. So in particular, I would have the sum from k equals 1 to capital K, and the sum from, we've got the size of each cluster, and then I've got the sum from over all the points, xi and xj, that are both inside cluster K, and then I'm looking at how close xi and xj are to one another, squared. So this formulation here goes back to our original definition of clustering, where we said we wanted to choose clusters so that points within the same cluster are close together. That was our goal. That's what we think of a cluster as being. And so this objective function here explicitly is saying we're looking at the sum of the squared distances of the points within each cluster. So this goes right back to our original definition of clustering, but the first definition I wrote, or the first objective function I wrote down, is going to be tied much more directly to the k-means algorithm and how we go about actually trying to estimate clusters from this. Are there any questions so far? Yeah.
we can also use like Gaussian like kernels to similarly draw like these circular boundaries, right?
Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between clustering and classification? So with clustering, like I mentioned earlier, it's an example of unsupervised learning. We have no labels associated with these points. So the only information we have is how close the points are to one another. With classification, we would have a label associated with each point. So we would basically be grouping the points based on the labels, not just the locations of the points. So very important distinction. Okay. So what I'm going to present on the next board is the k-means algorithm. And this is also known as Lloyd's algorithm. Oops. And before I present the algorithm, I want to emphasize this does not find the global minimizer of this optimization problem. Or it doesn't necessarily. And in fact, if we wanted to find the global minimizer, the very best possible clustering of our samples, this is computationally hard to solve exactly, especially when you've got large numbers of points. So we are resorting to greedy methods or approximate methods that will try to find a clustering that is hopefully making the value of this objective function small, but it might not be as small as possible. So, first, we are going to initialize with some estimates of what the centers are, mu1, mu2, all the way to mu k. And we're going to talk about how you choose those initial points or those initial cluster centers in a few minutes. But for now, let's assume that we've got some way to make some initial guesses about what those cluster centers or cluster means are. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to iterate. So I'm going to put in a little superscript here, 1, corresponding to this is my initial guess. And then I'm going to say for t equals 1, 2, wait, do I start with, yeah, right, 1, 2, 3, etc. So I'm going to keep on iterating. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to figure out which point belongs to which cluster. So for I equals 1 to n, we're going to go through all of our training samples. And for each sample, we are going to set ki. So this is going to tell us for the ith sample, which cluster k does it belong to? And so this is going to be the arg min over k of the distance between xi and mu k. So we're just trying to find whichever cluster mean we are closest to. And we're going to use our current estimate of the mean. So now what we have is an estimate of which sample is within which cluster. Now what we're going to do is use that information to update the estimates of the cluster centers. And so what we're going to do is come over here. So I'm going to end my I loop here, but we're still inside the T loop. So for k equals 1 through capital K, we are going to call our estimate of the kth cluster as being the set of all of the xi's such that the corresponding ki, the corresponding cluster, is equal to k. Okay, this might seem complicated, but the idea is exactly what you might expect. We've assigned each point to a cluster here, and now we're saying the cluster is all the points that were assigned to that cluster, or whose closest mean is k. Once we've defined our new cluster here, we are going to update the mean. So our mu sub k for the next iteration, t plus 1, is going to correspond to 1 over the size of that cluster times the sum over all the points in the cluster, and we're just averaging those points. So we're going back and forth between estimating the cluster centers and then, given those cluster centers, figuring out which point is closest to which center and then redefining what the clusters are. So then we would end the K loop, and then we would look and see if we are converged. And then we would end our T loop. So if we get to a point where the clusters are not changing from one iteration to the next, then we would stop. So in the course notes that I'll post online, there's a really nice illustration in vibrant colors from the Bishop textbook that shows you this algorithm in action for various iterations. So I'm going to try to reproduce it a little bit here, just so that we've got some kind of illustration, and hopefully it'll provide a little intuition. But we start with a collection of points here. And then we're going to have two different guesses of what those means might be. So this would be mu1 for the first iteration, and then I've got mu2 for the first iteration. So now, once I've got these initial sets of means, what I'm doing in this first loop over I is I'm saying for each sample, is it closer to the red point or the blue point? And so we are going to basically divvy up our points here. It'll look something like this. And so then this becomes our new estimate of cluster 2 for that first iteration. And this would become our estimate. All the points in this sort of hemisphere would be our estimate of cluster 1. So then what we do in this, so now we've assigned these clusters. And once we've assigned these clusters, we're going to take all the points that are here, and we are going to, in this red circle or hemisphere, and we are going to compute their average. So if we look at that, then it's going to, if we say, well, what's the average of these points? It might look something like mu1 for our second iteration. And if we look at the average of all of these points, then we would have something here that would look like mu2 for our second iteration. So we've shifted our means based on our new clustering. And so then in the next iteration, of course, we still have the same collection of samples, but our means are now different. So we've got this mu2 estimate here, and we've got this mu1 estimate here. And so now when we've got these new estimates of the mu's, we're in our next loop, and we're going to say for each point, is it closer to mu1 or mu2? And so our new estimate of the clusters, this is our new estimate of C1, and this is our new estimate of C2. And based on this, we now take the average of all the points in C1 to get our new cluster center. So in this case, this would be mu1 for the third iteration. And right here, we would get mu2 for our third iteration. Make sense? Yes?
But, like, how can we, like, initially know the number of k? Like, is that just, like, a guess?
So that's a great question. The question is, how do we set the total number of clusters that we want? What people will, there's a lot of heuristics. There's no fixed best way to do this. what people will often do is try clustering for various numbers of clusters and then choose the one that they like best in some sense. So for instance, it could be that if I start increasing the number of clusters, then I'm getting relatively little change in the value of my objective function. So it's going to continue to go down, but it might just stop going down quickly. So for instance, in this example here, if I were to try to cluster it with one cluster, the value of my objective function is relatively large. If I partition it into two clusters, all of a sudden the value of my objective is much smaller. Then if I start partitioning it into 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 clusters, it's not going to have as dramatic of a change in the value of the objective function. And so people will look for where that change starts to sort of taper off and choose K based on that, roughly. There's a variety of different heuristics, but they all are sort of like that. Yeah?
Is it possible that you just don't find a stable configuration and there's like some kind of cycle you can get into?
The question is, can this kind of cycle, so you never really converge, prove that this does converge to something? Now that something is going to depend on where these initial points are, and that something could be bad. You can prove that it will settle to the point where the cluster assignments stop changing from one iteration to the next. Excellent questions, guys. Okay, so now let's talk about initializing those means. The mu1 through mu k for iteration 1. And this can be extremely important because let me just give you an example of a case where bad initialization can go very, very wrong. So I'm going to have an example where I've got, I don't know, what looks to me like 3 clusters. Okay, but now let's imagine that when I choose my initial points, I choose them so that my first initial point or my first mean, mu1, is here. So mu1, 1. And then my second one is maybe here. So this is mu2, 1. And my third one is here, mu3, 1. So if I were to initialize this way, then what would happen is that this Lloyd's algorithm would eventually make this my cluster 1, and this my cluster 2, and this my cluster 3. Even though before I started drawing colors on this, you might have thought that a more natural clustering would be this is one cluster, this is a second cluster, and this is a third cluster. And in fact, the way I just described it would give us a smaller value for our objective function, right? So in particular, what we might, let me just try to redraw this. I've got my 3 different clusters. And if I had initialized this differently, so if my initial mu1 was here, and if my initial mu2 was here, and if my initial mu3 was, say, here, then the resulting clusters would be this set, and this set. So this clustering on the right gives me a smaller value of the objective function. It is absolutely better and closer to achieving our goal than this clustering here. But if I were to initialize Lloyd's algorithm with these initial points that I've drawn here, then I run the risk of Lloyd's algorithm converging to something that is absolutely suboptimal. Yes?
To avoid this, could you, after Lloyd's algorithm is settled, disturb each point, move each point kind of in a random direction by a small amount? Because it seems like the situation will have to be more of an unstable equilibrium, whereas the right's more of a stable equilibrium.
So I like the way you're thinking about trying to, introduce randomness to try to avoid getting to these sort of bad local minimizers. But I'm going to present an alternative way of introducing randomness that has some theoretical guarantees. So first of all, let me just say that the random initialization which sometimes I've seen called, I'm not even sure how to pronounce this, 4G's method, is basically to select k random xi's. So of my n different samples, I'm just going to choose capital K of them at random, and we are going to set these to be the mu k ones for my first iteration. Okay, so people very commonly use this. The alternative that I want to put forward is called k-means plus plus. So with k-means plus plus, we are also going to do something random, but it can be much stronger than this. So we are going to first select one of the cluster centers, mu1, by choosing one of the xi's at random. So I'm just going to choose one point uniformly at random. But then what I'm going to do is for all the subsequent points, for k equals 2, 3, all the way to capital K, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose one of my samples that's as far away as possible from all the means that I have so far. So we are going to find the remaining xi that is as far as possible from mu1, 1 all the way to mu little k 1. Okay, so let's try to make a picture of this. Is there too much glare? Maybe, huh? Even when it looks okay in person, it can look pretty bad in the videos sometimes if there's too much sunlight. Okay, so imagine these are my points. So I'm just going to choose one of the points uniformly at random, maybe this one. So that's going to be my mu1. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all the points remaining, and I'm going to choose the one that's as far as possible from it. And so maybe that's this one. So I can call this mu2 for my first iteration. And now what I do is I say, okay, let me look at all the points that are remaining and choose the one that's as far as possible from both mu1 and mu2. So if I were to look at this point here, it's far from mu2, but not far from mu1. So I would end up choosing something like this, for instance, mu first iteration, third cluster. Okay, so a pretty simple procedure. It can take a lot more time to compute this than random initialization, because for choosing each one of these means, I have to go through all of my samples. So I am paying an upfront computational cost in order to find this initialization. But the really remarkable thing about this initialization is that we can, let me just say over here on our method, we find the remaining xi as far as possible from the other mu's, and then we are going to assign that to mu, my new mu k. Okay, so we have this sort of remarkable theoretical guarantee associated with this, which is that if we were to look at the value of our objective function, so remember we highlighted that in orange in one of our earlier boards, and we were to see how big is that objective function value when we run k-means plus plus. What we can prove is that that is going to be less than or equal to the objective for the very best optimal clustering times a factor that scales like log of the total number of clusters k. So if we go back over to this other board where we had this illustration showing that if I had a bad initialization, I could end up, after running Lloyd's algorithm, with clusters where the value of the objective function is large, much larger than the value of the objective function for the best possible clustering. But with k-means plus plus, we have this guarantee that it is going to yield a value of the objective function that's not too big compared to the best possible value of the objective function. Yes?
Regarding this relationship, I would like to ask what would happen if we're just clustering into one cluster? Because in that log k would just be 0.
Yeah, usually if there's only one cluster, clustering's pretty easy, right? We just say every point's in the cluster. So we're really considering cases where k is bigger than 1. Yeah. Yeah.
What is exactly way of estimating or to measure how far is it from the previous data points? Is it by a square, sum of squares?
So you're basically asking how would we measure convergence?
Right here, why we are saying that mu3 is the one which is farthest from mu1, mu2.
Oh yeah, I'm just using squared distances.
And sum each of them out.
And what?
Sum up the distance.
No, I'm looking at so I'm looking for the point, and I look at the distance to the closest mu that I've already selected, and I want that to be as big as possible. So not the average, but the worst case. So I want to be as far as possible from all of the mu's, not just the average of the mu's. Yeah. Okay. So one thing that's kind of cool and interesting about this is that we can connect it to other ideas that we have discussed over the course of the quarter related to matrices and matrix factorization. So in particular, we are going to let capital X be the matrix of all my samples. So this is going to be an n by p matrix, where the first row is x1 transpose, x2 transpose, all the way to xn transpose. So we've done this many times over the course of the quarter. And now what we're going to do is we are going to write X as being, we are also going to consider writing two matrices, Z and U. So Z is going to be a matrix that is n by k. And all the entries, in fact, are going to be either 0 or 1. And so if zi little k, so this is capital K here, if zi little k is equal to 1, it means that xi is in cluster K. And if zik is equal to 0, then xi is not in cluster K. So Z is telling us for each of our samples which cluster it's in. So it's just a 0-1 matrix that's indicating the cluster membership of all of our samples. We're also going to have another matrix U, and this matrix is going to be capital K by P. And this matrix is going to contain all of our cluster means. So it's going to have, say, a small number of clusters here, and we're going to have mu1 transpose, mu2 transpose, all the way to mu capital K transpose. And so now if we look at the product, Z times U, what that's going to give us is a matrix where the ith row is going to correspond to the mean associated with the cluster that Xi is in. So it's a matrix that is n by p, same as X, with the ith row being equal to the mu sub k, where sample Xi is in cluster K. And so now what we can do is we can say, all right, our goal with clustering is to find cluster assignments, Z, and cluster centers, U, so that the distance between each point X and its cluster center is as small as possible. And so we can formulate clustering as saying we want to search over all matrices Z and U and find the pair where that product Z times U is as close as possible to X. Remember the F here corresponded to the Frobenius norm. And this just means I'm looking at the sum of the squares of all the entries of whatever is inside the norm here, or this difference between X and ZU in this case. So we've talked about clustering, very directly in terms of sets of points, but we can also think about it as corresponding to finding a set of matrices that have some constraints, right? We've got this 0-1 structure. Each point can only be in one cluster at a time. But finding the matrices Z and U that minimize this Frobenius norm. So it's another way of thinking about how to factor a matrix into a product of other matrices. Okay, any questions so far? Yeah.
Could you reiterate what does the ZU equal to?
So maybe what I can do is just show actually a tiny example. That might make it a little bit clearer. Okay, so in my example, I am going to have 4 points in 2 clusters. So I've got X1, X2, X3, and X4. And so if I had clustered these so that this group is equal to cluster 1 and this group is equal to cluster 2, then my Z matrix is going to be, first of all, we said it's going to be N, the number of samples, which in this case is 4, by K, the number of clusters, which in this case is 2. And so for my first point X1, it's in cluster 1 and not in cluster 2. So I'm going to have a 1 and a 0. For my second point, it's in cluster 1 and not in cluster 2. So I will have 1, 0. For my third point, it's in cluster 2, not in cluster 1, so I will have 0, 1. And for my fourth point, it's in cluster 2 and not in cluster 1, so I will have 0, 1. So my Z matrix is telling me for each of my samples, which cluster is it in and which cluster is it not in. And then my U matrix is going to represent the means. So let's say that here I've got my mu1, and here I've got my mu2. So this U matrix is going to have U1 transpose and mu2 transpose. And so now if I multiply these together, if I look at the product ZU, then what I'm going to get is, in my first row, mu1 transpose. Because I'm multiplying by this here. In my second row, I will also have mu1 transpose. In my third row, I will have mu2 transpose. And in my fourth row, I will have mu2 transpose. And so now if I were to look at ZU minus X, so just remember, X is going to have X1 transpose, X2 transpose, X3 transpose, and X4 transpose. If I look at the difference between these two matrices, and I compute the sum of the squares of all the entries in the difference, then I'm effectively looking at the sum of the squares, or I'm looking at the square differences between each of the xi's and its nearest cluster center. And so what I'm saying is that if we're trying to cluster our points, cluster the xi's, we can think about it as trying to find a matrix Z, which is telling me for each point which cluster it's in versus not in, and it's telling me the mean of each of these clusters. And so if I can search over all cluster assignments and cluster means, then I can cluster my points. Yeah?
This also for self-clustering?
The way I've set it up so far, each Z here can only be 1 or 0. And so then it has to be hard clustering because I'm only allowing there to be one per row. So then it has to be hard clustering. But you're right, I could have weights here, right? Like I could imagine saying, oh, point 1 is 90% cluster 1 and 10% cluster 2. And so I could use that to this matrix factorization with some weaker constraints on the entries of Z to represent soft clustering. That's an excellent point. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk about a variant of k-means that can give us a different type of clustering, which can sometimes seem appropriate. So imagine, for instance, that my points are organized like this. Okay, so they're, shoot, that glare is something else. All right, let's come all the way over here. Okay, so if I were to try to take a data set like this and cluster it into 2 clusters using k-means, then what can very easily happen, and will happen often in practice, is that the clusters will basically kind of split the data set in half, in the sense that, for instance, we would see something like this, where everything above this line would be cluster 1 and everything above that line would be cluster 2. But when we as people look at this, we might not feel like that's really what we want. We really want to think about each cluster as corresponding to points that are similar. And so we might feel like a more natural clustering would be to have all of these points in the middle be cluster 1 and everything outside of the middle be cluster 2. We can't achieve that with a method like k-means directly, because in this red clustering that I've drawn here, I could take 2 points in that cluster here and here, and they're very far apart, relative to the distance between either of those points and a point in the middle. So vanilla k-means, the way that we've laid it out, would not give us this clustering of points close to the origin versus far from the origin. But we've seen diagrams kind of reminiscent of this before, and we were able to overcome this or adapt to this sort of geometry by using kernels. And we can do the same with clustering. We can use kernels within the k-means algorithm, so kernel k-means, in order to get clusters that can show different types of geometry than what we would get with regular k-means. Okay, so in particular, let's look at a simple 1D example first. So imagine that I'm showing all my xi's in 1D, and here's maybe the origin, and my samples look something like this. So again, if I were to do regular k-means, then what can very easily happen is that I would say, oh, everything to the right is cluster 1 and everything to the left is cluster 2. And it feels a little unnatural because we've got this sort of group of points here that maybe we would like to be together. But we could also think about lifting these points into a higher dimensional feature space. So here we would have, for instance, our original xi. And on the vertical axis, we could have xi squared. And so now our samples here might look something like this. Not trying this to scale. And now, within this space, if we were to perform k-means clustering, we could get something very different, where we could say everything above this line is, say, cluster 1, and everything below this line is cluster 2, which amounts to having these points close to the origin in one cluster and the points far from the origin in a separate cluster. So just like we saw before when we did kernel ridge regression and the support vector machines, we can take this basic concept and execute it using kernels. So how does that work? So let's recall some of the key steps that we needed for k-means. So with k-means, within the Lloyd's algorithm that I helpfully just erased from the board, the key steps that we had to do were we had to say for each sample I, what was the cluster assignment? And we did this by looking at all the clusters and seeing how far xi was from mu k and choosing the closest one. The other key calculation that we had to make was we needed to compute the cluster means. So we had to say mu k was going to be 1 over the size of the cluster times the sum over all the points in the cluster of those points. Okay, so now we need to think about what these operations look like and what they mean when we start working with kernels. So in particular, what we're going to do is the following. We are going to think about doing this in a high-dimensional feature space. So maybe I'll do the arrow just one way. We're now going to be looking at some mapping phi to this higher dimensional space of xi. And we're going to do the same to the cluster mean. And we're going to compute distances within that higher dimensional feature space. So for instance, we could have phi of a scalar xi being equal to xi and xi squared, for instance, in this little toy example that I showed here. But more generally, and more specifically, we're going to be thinking about phis that correspond to kernel functions, just like we did with kernel ridge regression and SVMs. But intuitively what we are doing is we are taking our original feature vector and mapping it to a higher dimensional feature vector that can let us exploit richer kinds of geometry. Okay, but remember, just like with kernel ridge regression in the SVM, we don't necessarily want to have to compute phi of xi directly. We want to execute everything using the kernel function. So let's just think about how that might actually work. And for that, I'm going to need a little bit more board space. Oh, well, let me just say, in addition here, what we're going to have to do in order to find our means is the idea is that the mean in this higher dimensional feature space is going to correspond to the mean of all of the points xi after being lifted to that higher dimensional feature space. Okay, so that's how we're thinking about some of these key steps in Lloyd's algorithm. And now the question is, how can we do this with kernels? Okay, so if we're thinking about the argmin over k of phi of xi minus phi of mu k, 2 norm squared, then we can just expand this as phi of xi transpose phi of xi minus 2 phi of xi transpose phi of mu k plus phi of mu k transpose phi of mu k. So I've just expanded this squared norm into inner products. The first one is easy. Just by the way we've set up these lifting functions, this, remember, is our kernel function applied to xi comma xi. So already one part of this we can compute using our kernel function. So now let's look at the second part here. Phi of xi transpose phi of mu k. So we're going to do the following. We're going to say this is phi of xi transpose, and then we're going to plug in our expression for phi of mu k over on the other board, which was simply 1 over the size of the cluster times the sum over all samples in the cluster of phi of x. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to do sum over xj's just so that we're not confusing i's here. And so now I'm just going to rearrange my factors here. I'm going to have 1 over ck size times the sum over all samples xj in the cluster of phi of xi transpose phi of xj. And now I've got an inner product of 2 vectors in this high dimensional space, which I can compute with my kernel. So this is simply 1 over the size of the cluster, sum over all the samples xj in the cluster of my kernel function applied to xi and xj. So in this thing I'm trying to minimize, I can also express the second term using my kernel function. And so finally, we're going to look at, I'll just stick with yellow here, phi of mu k transpose phi of mu k. And again, I'm just going to plug in my definition of phi of mu k from the other board. So I'm going to have 1 over the size of cluster k squared, sum over all xi's in cluster k, phi of xi transpose, and then sum over xj's in cluster k, phi of xj. And so this I can just expand or write as a double sum over xi's and xj's in cluster K of phi of xi transpose phi of xj, which again, I can write using my kernel function. So 1 over the size of the cluster squared, sum over xi's and xj's in cluster K of my kernel function applied to the pair xi, xj. I just want to change my notation a tiny bit because we do have a specific xi that we care about here. And so I don't want to reuse I. So in this expression here in yellow, I'm going to change these xi's to xj primes, just so that we're not confusing our i's. Sorry about that. Okay, everything else is the same, just changing out the subscripts a little bit. Okay, so now we have an expression for this thing we're trying to minimize when we are making our cluster assignments that we can compute entirely using our kernel function. And so using this, we can write down an algorithm for kernel k-means. Unless, are there any questions first? Yeah.
For the third term that you just derived or went through, your summation, you're summing xj's and ck for both summations?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So if we think about it, mu k is just by construction the sum over x's in that cluster. And we've got the same kind of mu k in both sides of this inner product, and so it's exactly the same. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Say it again.
Are you doing the same in the orange, or is it only like that last line under the summation thing to the left, under the summation of the last line, instead of having xj within the clusters, the k cluster?
Okay, am I looking at the right spot?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is xj's, sorry, it should be a vector, in cluster K. So it is the same. Like if I just backtrack how I got here, right, we had phi of mu k, so I just plugged in my phi of mu k, which corresponded to a sum of xj's in cluster K. And then that's just, that same sum is propagating all the way down. Did you have a question?
Yeah, could you explain how this could possibly work in the lab? We saw an example where like the data was structured in like a checkerboard kind of thing, kind of format, rather than just like a visually accessible way like this. But would this be a similar approach that you could take in the case where data is structured that way?
So you're saying if I had data patterned in a checkerboard, could kernel k-means cluster it? So if I understand correctly, you're saying I've got maybe samples like this.
Yeah.
And what you want to happen is that this is one cluster and everything else is another cluster. I think that's plausible given the right kernel function. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly what kernel function would accomplish that, but it seems it seems plausible. Yeah. Yes?
For this like classification, why can't we just like classify it into like this bigger cluster and then 3 other clusters, and then we merge the 3 other clusters?
For this problem here?
Yeah. Like can we like manually like re-merge the clusters after clustering?
There's many different clustering methods, and we are only talking about 2 particularly famous ones that also build on other material in this class. But there are methods like hierarchical clustering, where you would form a hierarchy of clusters. So you'd have lots of tiny clusters, and then you would start merging clusters that are close or similar, for instance. So there do exist methods like this. But in terms of like trying to engineer a clustering algorithm based on what we as humans think of as reasonable clusters, that can get a little bit fraught because first of all, typically we're doing this in settings where the data is really high dimensional. So we don't have an easy visualization of the data. And taking data that's high dimensional, where each vector could have hundreds or thousands of elements, and then trying to visualize it in 2D can be very misleading. And certainly my intuition for high dimensions is not always great. And trying to think about things in 2 and 3D can lead me astray. So I think a better way to think about this is that what we started off by saying is that we want clusters where everything within the cluster is close or similar, and things in different clusters are not close or dissimilar. So now within the context of kernel k-means, we can say, well, instead of measuring whether 2 points are similar using their Euclidean distance, I can define a kernel function that's going to give me a sense of how similar 2 points are. And then what I want to do is cluster according to that similarity measure. And so different similarity measures are going to give you different clusterings. But rather than saying I'm going to engineer this based on a 2D visualization of high dimensional data, it's better to think, well, where did this data come from? What am I trying to accomplish? What do I want clusters to represent? And based on that, how should I measure similarity between points? So the power of, these kernel-like methods, as opposed to more black box approaches, is that we have some intuition about how we are measuring similarity that gives us more interpretable clustering results than we would have with a black box. Okay, so I'm going to show kernel k-means on a board without the glare here. So we're going to initialize, and the way we're going to initialize is slightly different than we did with Lloyd's algorithm. We're just going to start with some initial clusters, and I will use the hat here that these are my estimates. I'm going to, instead of initializing with cluster means, in part that's because I never want to have to calculate explicitly the cluster means because they could be in this super high, potentially infinite dimensional space. So I might not even be able to write down explicitly what the cluster means are. And so instead, I initialize with some initial cluster assignments. Then what I'm going to do is iterate. So for t equals 1, 2, 3, etc. And the first thing I'm going to do is try to find the nearest mean, or nearest cluster, sorry. To each sample xi, but in this high dimensional feature space. So in particular, okay, this is where my handwriting is going to be important. So we're going to compute the argmin over all clusters K of this objective that we mapped out on the other board. And so now I'm going to try to write my kernel function in a way that's not totally confusing. I guess I'll just put a little brackets on it so that we don't confuse it with all the other K's in here. So I'm going to have my kernel function applied to xi and xi minus 2 over the size of cluster K times the sum over all samples xj that are in that same cluster K of my kernel function applied to xi and xj plus 1 over the size of cluster K squared times this double sum over xj and xj prime in cluster K of my kernel function applied to xj and xj prime. So I'm going to use my kernel function to figure out which cluster is the best fit or is closest to my sample xi in this high dimensional feature space. Once I've done this, for I equals 1 to n. So I do this for all of my samples. Okay, so now once I've done this, I need to compute my new cluster assignments. Or, sorry, I phrased that wrong. So in particular, I'm going to say my new cluster K is going to be the set of all the xi's where the corresponding ki that we just calculated is equal to k. And we do this for k equals 1 through capital K. And then if converged, to stop. And so just a quick second, conceptually what we're doing is very similar to what we did with Floyd's algorithm, where we're alternating between figuring out which cluster is close, or for each sample, which cluster it's closest to, and then based on that, updating our designation of the clusters and going back and forth. The key distinction is we are never explicitly computing the cluster means. We're always doing it implicitly through our kernel function, capital K with the brackets. Yeah?
For finding case of I, just want to make sure your first two terms use your first sample that you're looking at, and then the third term uses all of the samples in terms of like the summation.
That's a great point. Yes. So in this optimization problem, this value in the first term is the same regardless of which cluster I'm considering. So I don't even have to consider it. And then here I'm looking, if we think about this kernel function as measuring similarities, then I can think about this as saying, well, what's the average similarity between my current point xi and all the xj's in cluster K? And then finally, in this third term, this one does not depend on my point xi. And so this is going to be the same for all of the different xi's. It only changes with the current kernel that I'm looking at. And so when you're actually like computing or coding this up, you can do this more efficiently and avoid recomputation of certain terms than the way I've kind of laid it out here. Great point. Yes?
What is the kind of meaning of the third term? The k, xj, xj prime. I get the second one saying like, okay, how close is each point to the kernel it's supposed to be in? Not the kernel, sorry. How close to each point the cluster is supposed to be in? But the third one, I'm not sure. Like, what does that kind of mean? Why is that being penalized in an intuitive sense?
So remember the origin of that expression was we were saying we wanted to know which cluster K made our point as close as possible to the cluster mean in this high dimensional feature space. And then when we worked out how to calculate that distance in the high dimensional feature space between xi and mean mu k, we had these three different terms. The first one is the one that we kind of crossed out on the other board. And the third term, which you're asking about here, is just coming directly from this term in the Euclidean distance. All right. Thank you so much. You guys had wonderful questions, and I will see you all on Thursday.